Before I get into the rumination proper, I want to make one thing clear. The reason that I gave so many times that I never got into this series was because of the fact that I had in fact played some of it. I had in fact read some of those short stories, about Geralt back in the day. This was several years ago now. And it didn't appeal to me. And that's really all it came down to. I've actually tried to explain this on my stream and to my viewers many, many times. And yet inevitably the question kept coming up. And yet, despite all of that, I knew one day I would, in fact, review, or that is to say, ruminate, upon the Witcher series. And the reason why is very simple, because I never gave it a fair chance. Now, let's be clear. Some games, some shows, some movies don't get a fair chance from me, because sometimes I see what I see, I don't like it sufficiently enough that I just say, nope, not my thing. In fact, I kind of came up with a code word for that. I referred to it as coffee. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying it's terrible or awful or anything like that. But I don't like coffee. This is true in real life. I don't drink coffee. I never have. I can't stand coffee. So it's coffee. But I wanted to give The Witcher another chance because there was just enough there that intrigued me, even though everything else put me off. So it was always in my mind to give The Witcher series another chance. I had that whole month rule set partially as a joke, but mostly because I was genuinely curious how long it would take for people to stop mentioning the series to me. And in fact, it did actually take until earlier this year. In truth, the month time did not, it was not ended recently. This actually happened earlier in this year, right about the time I was working on a few other videos, such as the Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep one, for example. And I was like, okay, as soon as I'm done with Birth by Sleep, I know exactly what my next rumination is going to be. Then real life got in the way, as it tends to do, and The Witcher turned out to be a rather long and involved game. Go figure. But here we are. So, let's go ahead and get this out of the way. One of the things I did rather deliberately was I made an effort not to read any of the additional works by the author whose name I am not going to try to pronounce because I don't want to do disservice. The author of the Witcher series. And I didn't want to look into any of the additional ancillary works or on the wiki or do any research, nothing. I wanted my sole exposure to this setting and to this world, to this story, to be from the game. From the Witcher PC game, nothing else. Part of the reason for that is because I wanted to see how much of it would actually, how much of the world it would show me. Would it show me a sliver? Would it show me a hints, tidbits of the world at large? That sort of a thing. It's the kind of thing, for example, if you were to play a single Star Wars game, how much of Star Wars, which is arguably one of the largest franchises that exists, counting the extended universe, how much of all of Star Wars do you get from just that one game? The other reason I did it was I wanted to basically not have a biased opinion walking into it. I wanted to take The Witcher, the video game, because that's what I'm interested in here. In this video, this is about The Witcher video game, and I wanted to see how that video game stood completely on its own merits. Because I fully well know how much knowing background material or deleted scenes or the novelization or whatever can change your opinion on something. So that left me with playing through the game proper. Let's go ahead and do the usual thing here. I'm not going to do a huge no spoilers request. I would request that there be no spoilers for The Witcher 2, because I have not played The Witcher 2. Yes, I'll be playing it next, don't worry. But I would request no spoilers for that because I would like to walk into that basically as I am doing so right now, which is to say, blind. I would also request that those of you who are great fans of the works of the Witcher series and all of its various settings and whatnot, please go easy on me, because again, I haven't researched everything. A lot of this is going to be speculation based solely on the game, and if I'm getting stuff wrong, I'm sorry. No disrespect is intended. I have a lot of notes to go through, as you might imagine. So we're going to start off with the usual gameplay-related stuff that I had. I actually had more gameplay thoughts than I thought I would. First and foremost, probably one of the very first thoughts I had regarding combat in this game is that there's a very distinct tempo to it. After a while of playing, I got used to the actual animations and knowing when I should attack as opposed to actually waiting for the icon to light up, because it was always at the same moments within the animation, as long as you were using the right attack type on the right enemy type. However, as I kept doing that, as I got used to that rhythm, that motion, it kind of, the tempo of it made me think, and maybe this is me reading too much into it, but this game does seem very subtle, so maybe not. It made me think that maybe that was intended to get across the pace of how Geralt, specifically, or perhaps Witchers in general, function. That they have that... They have an actual pace, a tempo to their existence, and so that is actually how they fight, with that rhythm. I could just be reading too much into it, but that's probably the first thing that occurred to me when I was doing that. One of the other things I like about this is, for all intents and purposes, this is your standard Baldur's Gate / Neverwinter Nights / Neverwinter Nights 2 / Dragon Age style gameplay, with a few exceptions. I don't mean that as an insult, by the way. Please don't take it as one. Quite the contrary, I really enjoy those kind of games, and in fact, about 2 years ago, Pax and I made a run, and we played Neverwinter Nights, all its expansions, Neverwinter Nights 2, all of its expansions, pretty much back to back. There was a gap in there for real life purposes, but otherwise we just burned through those games, because every now and again you just feel like playing that sort of game type. At least I do. And so it was nice to have another entry into that, another type of game that I could play and say, yeah, okay, I can do this sort of thing again. And the alchemy and crafting aspect of the game was frankly fascinating. Very well developed, very well done. Obviously you can study, you can buy recipes, you can earn recipes, or you can just craft, you can just experiment and see what you can make of what you have. I really like that system, and it actually was a lot of fun. Making, learning, all the different recipes for potions, and of course getting all the materials, and some of which were quite rare, so in some cases, you know, you would only have enough for one potion, you know, boss monster drops, that kind of a thing. One of the other things that I wanted to comment on, this was probably my very first thought as I was going through the prologue in the Witcher Fortress, whose name I do not remember off the top of my head, forgive me. As I was going through there, one of my very first thoughts going through this was, well, now this is the kind of Neverwinter Nights game I wanted to play. Allow me to explain why. For those of you not aware, Neverwinter Nights 2 came out very close to The Witcher 1. And I got Neverwinter Nights 2 when it came out, played the heck out of it. But one of the problems with Neverwinter Nights 2, in fact, arguably the only problem with it, is it's an Obsidian game. And for those of you who don't know, Obsidian, great stories, great settings, great characterization, great plots, don't really know how to make a game out of that. And I mean no offense to them, but honestly, KOTOR 2, Neverwinter Nights 2, there's actually another one that I can't remember. It's one of their more random ones. You know, basically every game they've ever made has that exact same problem with it. And so it was rough. It wasn't actually buggy per se. I mean, obviously there were some bugs. There's always going to be some bugs. Even The Witcher, I had one crash the whole time playing. Just one. But my point is, The Witcher felt so much more smooth. It felt like a more polished game. In fact, I had to go double check the release dates, because for some reason I was thinking The Witcher came out much more recently, even though intellectually I knew that wasn't possible, because I know when I played The Witcher, it was years ago. At this point, we're approaching about 6 years ago, actually. So, not that recent of a game, but it felt a lot more recent. However, it is worth noting that there are a lot of artifacts of older PC games within The Witcher. And I mention this for anybody out there who actually hasn't played it and is thinking about picking it up. Obviously, I did my assessment where I do recommend the game in general, but let's go into a couple more specifics. A lot of older PC games were especially RPGs, were very heavily script-based, and The Witcher is no exception. You can find ways, usually without meaning to or trying to, which is what happened to me in many cases, not just in this game, but in other games of this type, where you kind of do things out of order, and so the scripts, the triggers kind of get just a little bit thrown off, and as a result, things don't go in the order they should. Sometimes things get blocked off, sometimes things get knocked off to the point where you can't do them, or you have to find some kind of a workaround and pull up a cheat code or a save code or whatever in order to fix it. That kind of thing is the kind of thing you get used to playing those older PC games. Listen to me, older, it's only 6 years old. That being said, I do have to give The Witcher props because there was no moment in the entire game where I had to edit my save game or use console commands in order to fix the situation I was in. There was always some kind of built into the game method by which to advance the plot or advance the quest or whatever without having to basically directly brute force it. So definite props. Again, it's part of that whole polished feel of the game. It does have a lot of camera issues. Probably my single greatest complaint about the game, other than the thing I'll get to in the story section, is the cameras. Oh my god, there were so many times where the camera would lock itself straight up, and so I'd be looking down and I couldn't fix it. It would not respond to anything. Sometimes, and this actually happened to me more than once, sometimes the camera would be confused on its location. So let's say here's the map, right? And I'm up here. This is the whole map. This is the whole area that's rendered right now. I'm way up here. And the camera would be like, oh, I'm down here. And then it would just sit here. And then I would move a little bit, and the camera would be like, oh, you're up there. Hang on. And it would zoom across the entire thing. The very first time I saw it, I actually thought it was intentional. Because I was like, and here is the outskirts village. No, it wasn't intentional. It was a bug. It happened a few other times. Most notably when I was in Vizima, it actually went through buildings and stuff. It was kind of amusing. There were a few other really, really little things, but honestly, I don't want to actually go into all of them per se. Basically because it feels like nitpicking. The only thing that actually detrimentally affected my enjoyment of the game, the load times were kind of bad. I don't want to bash the load times, because, okay, I don't mean loading between the screens, but one thing I noticed very clearly is anytime any conversation started, the game has to, and I understand what it's going, I don't want to go into the full coding, but basically it has to push the entire game into a different state so it can then load and function in cutscene mode, right? So everything would go like that, and then it would show the character you're about to talk to, and there's always about a 2-second pause, give or take, as it loads up the entire conversation. And what it's doing there is it's actually checking every little flag that may or may not affect this cutscene and what they say and how they say it and stuff like that. And then it will go through it, and on occasion there would be similar pauses in the middle of conversations as it's doing that same flag checking, like, I think about this. I don't have anything more to say about this matter, that kind of a thing. And it just got a little bit jarring. But again, all of these things are small issues. Nothing really made it to the point where it was a frustrating game to play or it was an irritating game to play where I actually was actively not enjoying myself. That actually never happened. So props to them. I really like how they do leveling. It's kind of a slight variation on the standard leveling formula, which is good. There's no need to completely deviate or come up with a brand new wheel every time you're trying to come up with a system. But they have this tiered points increasing the effectiveness of your stats, which in turn increase your ability to do certain actions, intelligence being the big one for alchemy. And you can increase what your attacks do, their chance to hit, their damage, that kind of a thing. You can increase your magic, what your magic does, and all that sort of thing. And there's this sort of checkpoint tiered system as you get bronze, silver, and gold medals in order to move your way up there. It's basically a slightly more complicated talent point system, but it works very well. And I actually really enjoyed leveling up and figuring out exactly how I wanted to do things. By the way, I was pretty much a full-on melee, as per my usual. Although I did crank the ARD, or ARD, I'm not actually sure how to pronounce that, sign pretty much as I could, because yes. One other small thing I want to talk about. This is a very small thing, but it is definitely worth note. This game has a loot all button. Yes. Any game that has loot, with some extremely rare exceptions, should have a loot all button. There should be I just want to take everything on that corpse and dump it in my inventory. Similarly, there's one other convenience feature this game has. It's a sort and stack button. You just hit it right there. You got 2 inventories. Your basic inventory, well actually you got like 5, but whatever. Basic inventory and your alchemy points. You hit that button and it stacks everything up, so it's not all distributed, and it sorts it appropriately. Yes, definitely. I always like convenience features like that. Very well done. Excuse me. So maybe I'm being overkind, but I do really like the way that they added a fairly large number of tactical options throughout this game. I had to like adjust my mindset on the thing a little bit later as I realized that most, PC RPGs, especially ones that are based on D&D, have similar options. There are quite a bit you can do in combat, especially since most other games have a party. In this case, you do not. However, nevertheless, despite pretty much always being just the one person, they still give you options in combat. Ways you can use the signs in order to affect or disorient or stun your opponent, so you can do the coup de grace thing. The ability to throw the bombs, which does tons of damage based on certain circumstances, and how you build the bombs. There were plenty of options. There were plenty of things you could do. It was never just... And yet, and this is really important and speaks to the quality of the design here, you could still hack and slash if you felt like it. There were a couple days I was playing this game, I didn't feel like thinking. I was at a bad day, and I was like, whatever, so I just hack and slash my way through everything. And I could. And that's a good thing, because it means you're not forced to go through all this complexity if you don't want to. It makes it actually optional, rather than just another form of mandatory. I do also have to give lots of praise for this game for feeling a lot more open than it actually is. Again, like Neverwinter Nights, like Dragon Age, there's a zone. You're in this zone, this is the full extent of whatever, and there's loading areas, and you go to a loading area and it loads a new zone. Yet at no point in time did I feel like I was in a corridor, or did I have any feeling of claustrophobia or anything like that. Quite the contrary. The very first area I was in, well, the very first area after the tutorial, the outskirts, felt astonishingly open for what is effectively just a brief little stint during your adventure. And that feeling never went away. The swampy areas, New Vizima, Old Vizima, every area of the game actually felt much larger and bigger than it had to, which really got across the feeling that you're actually in a place rather than in a game. So definite props on that one. Similarly, the game always went out of its way to reward exploration. You go over to this area that, there's no quest, there's no markers over there, you just go over there, maybe there's some herbs, maybe there's some kind of chest you can loot, maybe there's some kind of quote-unquote unmarked quest, where there's just, some guys getting attacked, or maybe there's some monsters out there or whatever, which you can get ingredients off of. Maybe there is, in fact, an actual quest out there that you can do. Tons of stuff like that. So, definite props for the overall feeling of explorative and open-worldness, despite not actually having either. And I do... Okay, two more things I'm going to talk about gameplay, and then we're going to go and get into story, which is where I'm really going to talk. One, well, okay, I guess as a side note, I do like playing poker in this game. I actually really enjoy poker, I always have, even though this is basically a 5-card draw. Still, it was fun, and I actually had a decent amount of time just doing it, pretty much for the heck of it. I never needed the orans, it was just for fun. But the other things I want to note here... One... The quest tracker in this game, again, symptomatic of older PC games, is kind of crap. It's not actually indicative of what you need next. It's more like they had to manually flag, okay, this is where you go for this step of the quest. It's not always actually where you need to go, or maybe it can be confused if you do the quest in the wrong order, or maybe you killed this guy and the game doesn't know that. Bottom line is the quest tracker was actually kind of bad. But I'm not listing that as a negative. See, this is the really weird thing. When it comes to quest tracker as a mentality, I know there's really diverse camps as far as this, segregate camps. I know the two camps very violently disagree with each other. Some people want absolutely no quest tracking, no objective listing, nothing. Some people want full tilt, I want to know exactly what I want and I want exactly where it is, kind of a thing. And I can see the merits of both sides. I personally prefer it to be an option. This exists, but if you want to turn it off, you can, basically. However, this game, its quest tracker was so bad that I basically stopped looking at it. I never marked my next, I never was like, mark my next quest. I almost never actually read it. I just paid attention. I effectively played the game with no quest tracker, pretty much from Chapter 1 onwards. And I liked that, because as long as I was paying attention to what they were saying and how they were saying it, and, catching the names and the items they need and what those items came from, and asking all the options of the NPCs and blah, 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 I was never at a point where I was actually lost. I was never at a point where I was like, well, now what? Or where do I get blah? No, because the guy told me where to get blah, and he told me to get blah over near by the other blah, And I like that. So it's kind of a weird situation because I heard at least two other people I know have complained about this exact same feature, and I can now speak with authority saying, well, just ignore it. Just totally ignore the quest tracker and just pay attention, play the game. I know some people don't actually have the interest or, you know, the gaming memory, for lack of a better term, to do that, but honestly, a simple notepad fixes that surprisingly well, because then you take your own notes. Says, okay, I need 5 ghoul livers. They're by the graveyard in the northeast. Bam. Last thing I'm going to say. There's no avoiding this. The sex cards are dumb. I'm sorry. They're just dumb. Okay. I am going to speak positively about this in just a moment, but in all honesty, I don't get why they're even in this game. From what I understand, they are not in The Witcher 2, which is great. I'm down with that. But many people I've talked to who are even fans of The Witcher, who have sold me on The Witcher, who have told me, yes, you got to play this game, it's so freaking amazing. And there's always that little asterisk of just ignore the sex cards, because I'm lost for words. I don't know what to say about them. But I will say this for the game. There was not one moment, not one, in the entire game where I had to get a sex card. Not one. Every single one was optional. In some cases, they were so optional, I didn't even know were there. Once I actually beat the game, which was actually about 30 minutes ago or whatever, you know, I beat the game, looked up a couple things I was curious about, and then sat down to start recording. I looked up, you know, like, there was a list of missable stuff, basically, stuff you can do in each chapter. And I'm looking down the list, and it lists the women that you can bed and get their cards. And there were like 3 or 4 in chapter 1, and I'm just looking at that like, really? Because I knew there was the one, Abigail. That was obvious. The other two, it's like, really? That was, I didn't even know you could do that. It was just some random peasant girl or whatever. Okay, whatever. But I did like the fact that it was basically purely optional. That's always something I'm really big on. If you're going to introduce a feature like that, make it optional. If you're going to introduce a feature that you know some people aren't going to like, and if it is within the power to not break the game to do so, make it optional. This is true across the board, not just like controversial stuff or whatever. The quest tracker is a great example. Making a quest tracker optional. Making a difficulty slider rather than enforcing a difficulty level. Having optional bosses in addition to regular bosses. That kind of thing. I'm always such a huge advocate of that. So definite props to them in this manner. Now this is going to be the cutoff point for spoilers. Now I'm going to go ahead and go down this list here of my notes for the story. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with, just to refresh, because, you know, I know there might be a couple new viewers with this video. Story. There's plot, there's characters, there's setting, which is backstory, history, the world, that kind of a thing. There's themes, and then there's atmosphere. This is what story means. When I say story, this is what I mean. If I mean plot, I'll say plot, which is the main plot of this, you know, is this. But the overall story is what I'm going to be talking about here. And then I have one last page of notes here, which is the stuff that really made me think. So, apologies for putting that last, but it seemed most logical. Now, I do apologize, but I do have to say that one of the things I like about this game is, even though I know almost nothing about the overall mythos and franchise and whatnot of this setting, there was a very clear attempt to treat it with a degree of respect on the hand of the developers, and I like that. It's a very rare developer or author or movie maker or what have you that will take an existing franchise and hit that right balance of being willing to do something with it, you know, either in terms of changing something or reimagining or whatever, and at the same time striving to maintain true to the feeling of it, the core of it, right? And I could talk about this at length, but in general, admittedly not knowing that much about this, and maybe I'm totally wrong, and maybe you guys are just going to yell at me for how incredibly stupid I am here, but in my opinion, based on what I saw in the game, the developers definitely had that mentality. They did, I already know this, I know they've changed a few things from the short stories and whatnot, but at no point did it feel like they were doing so to the detriment of the setting. In fact, there was a lot of references, a lot of fleshing out of the world, a lot of explanation, and that kind of a thing. So definite props there. Now, I actually have a note here. I forgot to go back about this. It says here, I wanted to see how much of the world is expressed within the game. And then there's a little simple yay, nay. I'm going to go ahead and put that as a yay. Admittedly, the first 2 chapters, you only get tiny little tidbits, stuff that you wouldn't really catch unless you're really paying attention or really perusing the journal. But by the time Chapter 3 rolls around, you're starting to get a really clear picture of the world this is taking place in, the politics of it, the Lodge of Sorceresses, the 3 major kingdoms, the Great Empire, who's, Niflgaard? I'm sorry, I'm really bad with names, but the Great Empire. That's always a constant threat. You know, the Roman Empire basically is the very distinct impression I got there. The method by which certain people maintain power, the overall opinion of the people, the way magic is both perceived and used within the setting, the way anything different at all is perceived within the setting, you know, the way the Witchers themselves, you know, so much of this world was expressed just within this game, so that's a definite yay on that. I really like the very concept of Witchers, and it's going to sound weird to explain why, because if I were to boil it down to someone who'd never heard of this series, I would say a Witcher is a very specialized adventurer. But what has been done here is, in most settings, adventurers are just people. You know, they decide to take up the call, they get skilled, you know, they level up, in other words, they get better at what they do. Get more skilled, get more equipment, and that sort of thing. And usually they die young, because that's adventuring for you. But they go through, and my point is anybody could be an adventurer in many settings. Not all, but many. In this setting, a predisposition towards how an adventurer could be created is made with the whole mutation thing. Geralt himself, throughout The Witcher, is very clear on the fact that he is not human. Whether that's true or not is debatable. I imagine that's actually more his opinion on the matter rather than any absolute fact. If you ask my opinion, I would say he is not human anymore. He is sufficiently divergent to be considered his own separate species, a mutant, if you will. So I'm with that. But the point is, through those mutations, through the training, through the magical sign usage, all the different things that go into making a Witcher, that's how they become an adventurer. Any old Joe can do it. You know, that guard, Michael or Merkel or whatever his name was in Chapter 1, couldn't do it. Vincent, well, actually, okay, Vincent's a bad example, because he was a werewolf. But Vincent, without the werewolfism, couldn't have done it, you know, etc., etc. It takes something special to actually become a adventurer, aka a Witcher in the setting, and I actually really like that. I also like the idea of the concept that being at that level of power, which, when you look at an overall scale of things, is not that much higher than everyone else. Obviously, a Witcher is going to be better than any old Joe, and probably better than a trained soldier, and probably better than a really elite, well-trained, well-equipped soldier. Obviously, Geralt is, because he was the main character. But my point remains. A Witcher is still going to be above those in terms of personal power. But when you look at the overall scale of power, this is a matter of inches here, when you really think about it. And yet, even reaching such a small amount greater than everything else takes years of training, of experience, of mutation, and as has been mentioned several times throughout the game, not everyone survives that process. And Geralt himself is actually unique in that he survived even further than, well, basically anyone else in his particular, I don't know the proper term, forgive me, class did. So I just find the whole concept absolutely fascinating, especially for the second point, which I am now going to get into. It is a truly rare game I play where I get to play a mercenary. Now, I know what you're going to say. Oh, what are you talking about? No. I don't know how to explain this without saying it the way I just did, so forgive me. MechWarrior 2 Mercenaries was the first game I played where I really felt like a mercenary, and it was a lot of fun. I really enjoy that type of gameplay as kind of a break from my usual, well, the Mario, to be honest with you. The kind of guy who is out for the paycheck and not... It's layers, it's shades of gray, you know? He's not just out for the money, but he is definitely prioritized on the money. He is not only going to do anything that people tell him to do, but he is still going to consider doing things he wouldn't otherwise do, you know, etc., etc. There's shades here, but that kind of a character is something I really don't get to play very often, because very few games, in my opinion, really get that across well. Usually they go a little bit too far over here to the amoral side, and the point is not to be amoral. I'll talk about amorality and immorality in a bit. The point is to be driven by your profession. If you'll forgive me for a quote, props to anyone who recognizes it, a pro isn't someone who sacrifices himself for his job. That's just a fool. And that's the point. A professional is someone who goes in there and professionally wants to accomplish their job, maintain their contacts, maintain their reputation, get paid, you know, all these fun things like that. It's one of the reasons that the whole concept of a bounty hunter in Star Wars has always appealed to me, because well, granted, bounty hunters run the gamut from pretty much black to white in Star Wars, but there's plenty of room in there to play that type of character. This game really gave me that feel for pretty much the entire game. For anybody who's curious, I chose the so-called neutral path. I found out later that it was actually a distinct path from the Scolatile, forgive me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, and the Order of the Flaming Rose. Pretty sure I'm not pronouncing that wrong. And that path, I never deliberately did that. I never said, I will be neutral. You know, I will choose the I take over New Vegas option. No, it just came to me naturally because of the way I was playing the character. Because, well, I'll talk more about the difficulty and the conflicts between those two sides in a moment. So, one of the other things I really want to go into, though, is the idea of choices in this game. I mentioned this during the assessment. This is one of the very few games I've played where it felt like my choices really mattered. If you look at it statistically, if you look at it roughly, they only really changed the flavor and style of the game. But realistically, that's pretty much as far as that sort of thing usually goes. I could literally list out all the games that I've played that I really felt like my choices mattered. Ogre Battle, SNES, Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 1, definitely. You'll notice something missing from that list. Dragon Age, Origins, Baldur's Gate 2, you know, that kind of a thing. And Planescape Torment is another good one. But this game definitely joins that list. At every point in time, it just, as much as I hate to say this, it made me kind of grin a little bit every time something would happen, and I knew, or it was stated outright for me, that it was happening because of A, B, and C that I'd done back there. I like that. I like having the consequences of my actions come back around. I like feeling like I am impacting the world, even as the world is going on without me. So that was a huge thing, a definite plus. I very much like the intended goal to have choices matter later rather than now. There's a very strong reason for that, and it's the fact that a lot of games... Okay, I've played Tor, the Old Republic, Star Wars The Old Republic, it's an MMO, and your choices matter in that game. Now, you'll notice I didn't list it on that list. That's because I never felt like my choices mattered in that game. But I'm not getting into that. The point I make here is that if you made a choice, you would see pretty much immediately what the consequences of that choice were based on the dialogue, based on the presentation and what they were saying. You could pretty much deduce right then and there, okay, that's what happens. And in Star Wars The Old Republic, you can then hit escape. Leave that confo, start it again, try the other path, see what happens the other way. Now, don't mistake me. I do actually like that. And in fact, that's actually one of the better features of The Old Republic, in my opinion. The fact that you could see the different choices and have a degree of idea of what you're choosing. I'll get to that more in a moment. But I really liked the fact that I would make choices basically just purely because I was role-playing. Because this is what my character, my Geralt, would do. And then things happened. And I'll go ahead and tell you right now, it didn't always work out particularly well. I was pretty pleased with how Chapter 1 turned out. I was absolutely appalled at how Chapter 2 turned out, and any of you who've played this game can probably guess everything about that. I really botched Chapter 2, and it was pretty obvious by about, I don't know, the two-thirds way through that point. I was like, okay, I've totally messed up. And I know it. Now... I'm trying to think where to go next. There's so many things to talk about with regards to choice. One of the things... okay, let's talk about this. I just mentioned the Tor thing with trying to figure out what the next option was. One of the reasons for that is a lot of games that have choices and dialogue options won't actually write out the whole dialogue. That was something that more often happened in older games. You know, the Baldur's Gates is a great example of that. But when you get to a game like Dragon Age 2, or Tor is another good example. I swear there was another example that wasn't BioWare related. Anyways, when you get to more, that was it. Oh shoot, what's that game called? Alpha something, Alpha Protocol or something like that. Anyways, you would get a context symbol or a context thing, or maybe just like a short phrase or a couple of words intimating what it is you wanted to say. And I know I don't speak just for myself here when I say that oftentimes what was actually said after I picked that is not what I wanted to say, nor what I thought I was saying. So that's why I like that option in games like Tor. I was like, oh no, that's not what I meant. Escape, escape, escape. In this game, they did something, and I talked about this back in Dragon Age 2. I really hated that feature in Dragon Age 2. In Dragon Age Origins, it would write out all the text you said, but you had no voice actor. And I always felt that the best in-between option here was to just have all the text written out, exactly what the voice actor would say, and then have the voice actor say that, and have him mean that, rather than this, you know, oh, I'm going to say pants, to use the Yahtzee example, and it could mean anything. So I really like that, and that's a really, really awesome, probably, I know this is going to sound weird, but that's probably the first thing that really, really impressed me about this game, was that you have a dialogue option, you pick it, and then you say the words there. I know that sounds so simple, but you'd be amazed how few games do that. In fact, I actually am having trouble coming up with another one off the top of my head right now. So, most games that do have the actual dialogue written out have no voice acting. The Elder Scrolls series is a great example of that. The Fallouts are another good example of that. Dragon Age Origins is another good example of that. One thing, before I move on from the whole dialogue option things, one thing I really like is that, admittedly, the English voice actors were kind of a mixed bag. That's pretty normal for PC gaming. You know, usually you get some good, some bad, and some in between. But in general, most of the voice acting got across some of the nuances of what the lines were. And so when Geralt would say something, usually he would put a little bit more. His presentation was actually quite subtle. If he was angry, he wouldn't. He would just put more force behind how he was saying it. When he didn't care, or when he was trying to be sardonic, he would say it in this really sort of slightly higher pitched tone, just barely. So it's like, oh yes, just I agree with everything you say, Your Highness, you know, that kind of a thing. And so there was a lot of subtleties and nuances like that that really helped flesh out the gray, the shades of gray that were in this game and were in the dialogue in this game. And so it made me feel like Geralt, excuse me, keep wanting to call him Geralt. Geralt was more of a human, more of an actual character, rather than a caricature. Sorry about that, guys. Had a bit of an interference. I shouldn't say that. It's actually my sister's birthday. So anybody who wishes to wish her a happy birthday, feel free to do so. Anyone who doesn't, well then, screw you. Now, as I was getting into it, I like the fact that Geralt is one of the more human characters I've encountered in a long time. I know a lot of people have different definitions of that word, and in fact, I myself actually have 3 definitions of the word human, and which one I'm using depends on how I'm phrasing the word. So, you know, I didn't say human or human. This is a human character. Yeah, I know, I'm weird. But he has just as much good and bad. He has just as much, you know, I don't even know how to put this properly. He feels like an actual person. He feels like someone who, if I met him in real life, he's not a character. He's not someone from a show or a play or whatever. He actually feels like a person. And I really like the way they got that across in his line, his dialogue, his presentation, his thoughts to himself, etc., etc. I feel like there's something I'm missing with the amnesia thing. I feel like there's some reason in the greater Witcher franchise, canon, etc., as to why he has this amnesia problem. Because near as I can tell, A, it only works when it's supposed to, and other times he remembers things just fine, and B, I'm not sure what the point of it was, because at no point did it really serve to flesh out his character, with one exception, and I'll get into that later. So, speaking of characterizations, one thing I do like about this game is it feels a lot more mundane and down to earth than most games. I shouldn't say I like that, because actually that's a total lie. I actually don't like that. But I do like the way they portray it, and it was done very competently and very well. It was very good coffee. The common folk were just as ignorant and illiterate, and generally, honestly, I could just use those two words: ignorant and illiterate. And that's why they acted the way they were. That's why they presented themselves the way they were. They were very basic. I don't mean that in a bad way, though. I don't mean like as an insult. I mean they were kind of how common folk were back then. Pretty downtrodden. It also really paints an interesting picture on how certain people could maintain power in that era. How someone who can read and write and knows about science and magic and other things like that, knows how to handle themselves, could rise to some kind of position within such a setting. It makes a lot of sense to me, and it's very interesting the way it's presented, and it's one of those things where if it was real life, I would be appalled and disgusted, but for a story, it's something that's absolutely fascinating. It's that whole Civil War thing all over again, the American Civil War thing. One of the things I like about, and I mean it this time, I do like it, is the shift in tonality between the chapters. The prologue was all about the setup. Chapter 1 was basically your classic fantasy RPG. Town, quests, monsters, doing little errands and chores. It was being an adventurer. Chapter 2 violently shifts into what is effectively a detective story. In all honesty, if I were to classify it, I would call it a noir detective story, because the way it's presented and the way the evidence has to be extrapolated with no advanced technology and no advanced magic in order to actually figure out what's going on. Those things are either don't exist or not available to you. And then we move on to chapter 3, where we've got... I'm trying to think of how best to describe it, because each chapter does have its own little different feel to it. And, chapter 5 feeling like... I'm just going to go ahead and skip to 5, because I'm fumbling at 3 for some reason. But... because chapter 3 was... okay, I'm sorry. Chapter 3, I remember now. Chapter 3 was the urbanization. Chapter 3 was the standard... chapter 3 felt a little bit more like your standard romanticized Western RPG. This is the kind of people in that area, in the market district and whatnot, that you would meet everywhere in most standard Western RPGs. These are not common folk. These are well-spoken. They know how to dress. They are... constantly going about their little jobs and whatnot, and it's several steps up from the actual common folk way back in chapter 1, and to an extent in chapter 2 as well. And then in chapter 4, we got to see pretty much the boonies, and while at the one hand it was kind of a return to your classic adventurer thing, with the fantasy, village, figure that stuff out, Chapter 4 felt a lot more personal, because Chapter 4's focus was very much not only on that whole wedding affair and the relationship between the humans and the... I have no idea how to pronounce it, so please don't ask me to. But it was very focused on Alvin and the main character's relationship with Alvin and whatnot. And then it is appropriate then that, given that, that was interrupted by the beginnings of what would become Chapter 5. And Chapter 5 not only has that epic finale feel to it, but more importantly, is an absolute upfront and frankly brutal way to get across the point of exactly what all these political things mean. You read on a paper, and you read in history books, and you study about, this and that, and this caused this, and he seized power in this area with these troops and all that fun stuff. Chapter 5 was politics realized. It was the Scoia'tael, again, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, Scoia'tael? Anyways, and the Order, both pretty much going full tilt against each other, with the king literally in the middle. And in my case, my Geralt, who was neutral, also in the middle. And the overall tone really got across the negative aspects of progress, I think is how I will phrase that. And I'll return to that concept later. So very definite, interesting shifts in tonality between the chapters. I really liked that. One other thing, I'm sorry, I actually meant to mention this earlier, but this only occurred to me, it's actually my last note on this page, is that I like one of the things that they did was if you made a certain type of choice, and I do mean a type of choice, not all choices were like this, but if you made a certain type of choice, then as you're going through, you will notice that other choices, other options have been barred from you because of that choice. And I like that for two big reasons. One, makes total sense. Of course, you can't go do everything. In some games, I do like the ability to go do everything. Fallout 2 is a really good example of a game where you can basically do everything, and there's not really much in the way of mutual exclusivity. But at the same time, in a setting like this, it really makes a lot of sense that if you help A, or if you do A, you can't go back and then do B, because B is either not there, or is your enemy, or has fled, or God knows what else. Now, forgive me as I now pontificate endlessly about The Witcher, because this is probably what most people really wanted me to look at this game for. This game receives a stamp, I guess, of made me think. This game really did make me think. One of the things that I enjoyed most in this game, and I don't have a good way to put this, is effectively its scale. This game, imagine if you're playing Final Fantasy IV for a moment, bear with me. Imagine if in that game you're playing as Bagan, the gentleman from Baron, and the entire game is about Bagan, and the entire game never really leaves the confines of the Baronian area. Now, obviously, because this is more fleshed out, it's more than just the castle and the town, but you get the idea. There's the castle, there's the town, there's the outskirts, there's the nearby farms, the nearby... because there's going to be all sorts of stuff like that near a major kingdom like that, right? But the whole of the game occurs right around Baron, just like this one occurs around Vizima. In other words, this game very much felt like playing an NPC in another story. But I don't mean that as a negative. It was a total shift in focus, in thematic approach. Most JRPGs and Western RPGs both tend to focus on world movers, or at the very least, continent movers or country movers, people who are at the center of very large-scale things, people who make drastic, sweeping changes for their setting, for good or for bad, depending. And that's part of the appeal there. You're playing, forgive me for the crass way of putting it, you're playing the guy. In this game, I never once felt like I was playing the guy. I actually always felt like I was playing that NPC. A very well fleshed out, very intricate, very well designed NPC, but nevertheless someone who is basically a member of one story, of the overall story, rather than a main central protagonist. Now, I do not know if that's going to retain true throughout Witcher 2, and for that matter, Witcher 3, but it's such a different approach to the style of the storytelling that it really engaged me. It also really let them focus a lot more on exactly what these broad sweeping things mean, the alliances between nations and the wars in the distance, and exactly how not just the common folk down at the outskirts, but people who live within the city commons, and people who are in the everyday military, and people who genuinely believe in cause A or cause B. It really was an excellent way to get across how these people are impacted by otherwise large-scale events, because we do get tidbits of large-scale events happening throughout The Witcher. But for the most part, we're not actually part of that. Not until pretty much the very end, and even then it's debatable how large-scale it is. I mean, if you really think about it, pull it back for a second here. We stopped one man and his criminal organization and his order that was attacking one small area, one region, basically, of a kingdom, and in so doing prevented him from his plan. Now, I'm not saying this to be derogatory, but that would be like a side quest in most other RPGs of different types, which is why in my assessment I refer to this as a European RPG, because of this difference in focus and this difference in storytelling style. One of the other things, though, to really needs to be emphasized here is the fact that at no point did I feel claustrophobic in terms of storytelling. And I know that sounds weird, but what I mean by that, it is too easy for a game to have a tight focus, like this one does, you know, on a very small area and a very small number of people, and feel like they're the only people in the world. Feel like nothing else exists. Probably the worst and most extreme example of this done wrong I can think of is a game on the N64 called Quest 64. If you've played it, you know what I'm talking about. I don't recommend you play it, by the way. But Quest 64 felt empty. It felt small. It never once felt like a world. It always felt like a series of corridors or a series of towns, and the people you interact with are the only people in the world, and that always bothered me. And Quest 64 is, of course, a super extreme version of that. Many RPGs do that. Even more modern RPGs do that problem to some extent or another. Never once did I get that feeling in The Witcher. I always felt like I was part of a world, a much larger story, a much larger experience that was going on around me, and I liked that. Now, the next big thing I want to talk about is the difference between amorality and immorality. In brief, for those of you not aware, immoral is to do something you know to be wrong. Amoral is to not know or care about the difference between good and bad or right or wrong. A strong argument could be made that Witchers in general are designed to be amoral. I believe there was a quote about them basically being a golem, for all intents and purposes, only intending to do what it is that they are ordered not to think, not to feel, and that actually is brought up several times by the enemies, by the oppressors. The professor himself mentions that more than once, I believe. You know, you weren't meant to think or to feel. You were meant to act, and you are a failure in that respect. One of the things that fascinates me about that is at no point does Geralt himself deny any of these things. And yet he at all times does maintain his own particular code of ethics. He is not amoral. At least not my Geralt. I'm not actually sure if that changes based on gameplay style. He is not amoral. He is not immoral. He is neither. Geralt is someone who is, as I mentioned way back in my mercenary thing, a mercenary. He has his things he cares about. He has his people he cares about. He wants to get paid. He wants to make it to the next day. He doesn't want to get involved in those bigger things because those are just a mess. But he is not a trained killer who will go do some horrible thing because you pay him. He is not someone who will go and massacre innocents just because he is told to. He is not someone who is going to not care about what exactly his job is. He actually wants to know what his job is and why. And in some cases he will accept the job and then go to do it, except he won't actually do it as prescribed because, again, he has his own things he cares about and wants and so forth and so on. Probably one of the most telling statements in this entire game, I thought, was when I cured the Princess Ada of her affliction. I forget what she called herself, a scurba or something like that. And he mentioned, there's one of those little vignettes that happens every now and again as you make a major choice or the story progresses. And he mentions how most people think of Witchers as monster hunters for hire. But the sword is the last resort. We usually prefer and derive more enjoyment and desire to remove curses, to cure people. And whether that's true for all Witchers or not, I feel that was absolutely true for Geralt, and I think that was very revealing about his character. Let's go ahead and talk about the Wild Hunt. Now, there is no denying the fact that the Wild Hunt is a major feature of this story and this setting and this franchise. Indeed, the mere fact that The Witcher 3 is titled The Witcher 3, The Wild Hunt, is kind of indicative, I think. But again, ignoring all the ancillary materials, just going off of what tiny little tidbits we got within this game, my opinion as of right now, my theory, I guess is the best way to put that, is the Wild Hunt is the last gasp of the old world. Whatever the old world really takes in this game is debatable, because it is my personal opinion that the elves and the dwarves and the so-called elder races are not the first races, they're just older than humans. I believe, based on the way things are presented, that there is something or someone still around that is older than that, and it still persists in the Wild Hunt. And as a result of that, it is still active and still moving throughout the world. There are so many times when the avatar, the king of the Wild Hunt, appears throughout the game, and I noted every single one of them. He was actually my final boss because I refused to allow him to take Jacques' soul, for example. Each time he showed up, I got the stronger and stronger impression that he was trying, or they were trying to pull the strings, so to speak, trying to move the pieces in such a way that by the end game of whatever it is they actually cared about, things would be in a manner that would be beneficial to them, whether for their return or a world more suited to what they felt for or whatever, or maybe they're secretly actually ruling the world behind the scenes, although frankly I think that's actually the Lodge of Sorceresses based on what I've heard, but again, that's super speculative. But the long and the short of it is I absolutely know I haven't seen the last of the Wild Hunt, and I'm very excited to know more. The White Frost is something else that's interesting, and I mention this now because I feel like, again, in the realm of speculativeness, that it is very connected to the Wild Hunt. You cannot tell me that having the current mortal realm being basically completely obliterated by ice and frost and snow and reduced to barbarism at best is not something that is also that the elder races, whatever they are, or the elder forces, whatever they are, would not want to some extent or another. It is also, however, something that has been presented in a way that it might be something completely mundane. There's just enough niggling doubt there that it could literally just be an ice age. It could be just a plain old ice age hitting this planet. Or it could be something that's actually a driven force to actually cover the lands in ice. Not sure which, still kind of speculating, but if I had to put money on it, I'd say it's something being driven. Just my thoughts. Let's see here. What do I want to talk about next? I want to save that one for pretty much dead last. Let's go ahead and talk about the ending, which isn't actually a cliffhanger so much as indicative of the style of storytelling the entire game has had thus far. It's very clearly showing that this is just another piece of the puzzle. This is just another stage in the story. Geralt himself says it flat. Some things end, and other things begin. I forget his exact phrasing. He said it better than I do. But it's very clear, the message there. This is just another chapter in the story. From what I understand, the series is intended to end with Witcher 3. And I actually think that's probably a good thing. They usually do want a definitive endpoint for your main story, at least the story of Geralt. But that being said, the message was pretty clear. They wanted to do another game. But they didn't leave it cliffhanger. And I like that, because too often a game, and this actually has happened more often than you think, a game will end on a cliffhanger, and they'll never get a sequel made because the first one didn't sell, or the company falls apart, or they lose talent, or times change, or they lose publisher, or whatever. There's dozens and dozens of problems that can happen. So when you end on a cliffhanger, you're basically promising to be continued. And not only does that kind of annoy people, myself included, but it's risky because you're basically promising something that might not happen. In this case, it was more, there will be another chapter, one way or the other. Thus, if the Witcher series never became a series, if it ended with Witcher 1, I would still call that a satisfactory ending based on the way the game was presented. It was just another chapter. Just my take on it. Alright, let's go ahead and talk about the big thing. This is the last bit I got. I don't need my notes for this. Although, Jacques, I gotta remember how to pronounce his name. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about the main villain now. Jacques is a fascinating villain, especially since we don't even meet him until so far into the game. Or do we? First of all, let me say that the twist that Alvin was Jacques was brilliantly done. If anything, it's kind of funny because it's one of those situations, I imagine there's some speculation on this matter, again, having not looked into it, because it's one of those situations where they never outright say flatly, Alvin is Jacques, Jacques is Alvin. They never say it flat out. But it's like back when Phantom Menace came out. Forgive me for comparing The Witcher to Phantom Menace. Everyone knew Emperor Palpatine was Darth Sidious. There was some room for doubt because they never said it outright, not till episode 3. But everyone knew Palpatine was Sidious. The evidence was so blatant and so overwhelming, not just literally, but thematically. Of course he was. So, I just wanted to get that away. I am of the absolute opinion that Alvin was Jacques, and I'm sorry, you probably cannot convince me of otherwise. So, big plot twist there. But that is probably the only real twist the entire story had, but it's an extremely effective one. It absolutely ties in the stories of the main villain and the main protagonist together intimately, personally, and thematically. Let's look at these two people, shall we? Geralt is someone who is a witcher. As I mentioned earlier, an adventurer who had to earn the right to be that adventurer. He's skilled, he's strong, he knows all this thing about alchemy and medicine, he is well learned, he is well spoken, he has good senses. But every single one of those things was earned. He had to work and train long and hard in order to be that good. He had to really force himself to be at the point where he could be considered that elite. Alvin, or that is to say Jacques, was innately powerful. There is a difference between skill and power. I talked about this during my FF marathon extensively when talking about the FF villains. And Jacques was someone who, while he obviously learned a great deal of discipline and refinement control over his years as he grew up in the past, he nevertheless never strayed from that source. Forgive me for the pun. Because he was a source. He was raw, mighty, incredible power. I actually postulate, theoretically speaking, that he still didn't know how to use it fully by the time we actually fought him and defeated him. He still was learning how to control his massive untapped power. The variance between those two characters is fascinating to me on the face of it. Then we add into it the fact that Geralt, the wizened, experienced, yada yada yada, is someone who always, at least in my playthrough, I'm not sure if this is always true, tried to impart his wisdom, his knowledge, his experience on Alvin, even at a very young age. I mean, it's extremely telling that Alvin would actually interrupt you every now and again to ask you what amounted to life advice from a child, which Jacques would then, let's just say it would become obvious in Jacques' approach and what he was doing, how that came to be. And I really enjoy the interpersonal dynamic between the two because it's obvious that Jacques still had a degree of respect for Geralt, even after all these years. When he came in to save him, he didn't just save him because, I owed you because you saved me all those times when I was a kid. It was also because he desperately wanted basically his father figure to re-enter his life at his side. Never once did I get the feeling that Jacques wanted a subservient when he offered for Geralt to join him. He wanted an equal. He wanted another, like him, equal relative level of power when considering raw power and skill, and he wanted that person to help him in his grand quest. And that's why he kept Geralt alive so much longer than he otherwise would have. That's why he interacted with him in the exact way he did so many different times. That's why, despite having numerous opportunities to deal with him, he never did, because Geralt was always going to be the crowning jewel of his plan. Reuniting with his lost father and using him to save humanity, just like Geralt used to do when he was a kid, when Alvin was a kid. Now, a lot about Jacques is purely speculative, so forgive me for speaking with authority that I don't actually have. For example, a lot of things we see within the Ice Plains, which is something that I feel like I'm missing some of the significance of that within the setting, but regardless, I got the impression that it was kind of a literal metaphysical battle of the mind kind of a thing, like that was an actual place, and that he was actually there. It just wasn't a physical place, if you follow me. Anyways, it is very debatable as to what there was real and what wasn't, what was a lie or illusion, and it's very obvious that Geralt believed that most of it was illusions, and yet every now and again he would encounter someone or something and he would just accept it on the face of it. And not only did that get me thinking, but there was a clear, distinct difference in tone from when something or whatever would show up to try and convince Geralt and when something would show up and act the way it or they should. So I don't think everything that happened there was lies. I don't think everything that happened there was an illusion made by Jacques to confuse or manipulate Geralt. I think that there was some genuine reality, for lack of a better term, that was bleeding through. That being said, it speaks to the raw power of Jacques that he could create a place like that. And it speaks to the raw power of the King of the Wild Hunt that he could so effortlessly manifest himself there. Both of those facts really rung out in my mind. I just wanted to mention them, nothing but speculation, but... All that being said, though, there is one final point to be made in the Geralt v. Jacques thing, and that's the fact that Geralt was effectively a savior of people. Not a literal savior, but he saved people, he helped people, he was in many ways a hero. Even though he didn't want to be, even though he didn't choose to be, even though on more than one occasion he actively resisted being so, he still nonetheless aided and helped people, no matter how bloody, no matter how brutal. It's pretty hard to deny that he did have a net positive impact. Jacques is someone who wanted, chose to be that kind of a hero, strived for it. And I feel like that's pretty much arguably the greatest message this entire game had, right there. Because Geralt, and don't mistake this, because this isn't about destiny or fate. It's about your mentality in your approach. Geralt cared about people, and so he would do things in such a way, and he would agree to things even though he otherwise wouldn't. And the long and the short of it is, Geralt would help people because that's Geralt. Jacques, I don't think he was just power hungry, but I think he was trying to live up to that ideal of Geralt, of the hero, of the champion of order and all that fun stuff, and in so doing revealed what kind of a person he really was. The kind of person who will force reality to do what he wants, to change the circumstances and the setting, to adhere to his ideology, regardless of what anyone or anything says or thinks about it. In other words, if I could put it into much more simple terms, Geralt was a proponent of free will, whereas Jacques was the exact opposite. But again, even that is just a summary that doesn't fully get across the complexity, so forgive me for failing in this. Now, I am out of notes. It was a good game, net positive. You know, there were certainly things I didn't like about it. But I did finally play through it. Yes, I'm going to play Witcher 2. It's next on the list. Hopefully I will see you when I get to that next time.